Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Amanda Sloan, and I'm delighted that you're all with me today. We're going to talk about designing a beautiful native plant garden. And we're going to talk more about civic landscapes, public landscapes, that garden club members might be more involved with. So I'm Amanda Sloan. I've been a member of the Sharon Garden Club for almost 30 years, and I'm also a landscape architect. I was a landscape designer and then became a landscape architect, and I've been doing that for almost 30 years also. And I specialize in ecological and environmentally oriented gardens. Native plants is one of my very special interests, and I've done a lot of work on designing native plant gardens for towns and cities and also homes. And we're very lucky today because I was supposed to present this lecture in person as part of Bonnie Rosenthall's Go Native idea for the Garden Club during this coming year. But of course, we're all stuck at home now through a partnership with the Ecological Landscape Alliance, which has the capability to present webinars. We're able to see this online today. So we're really lucky. And I sort of like to think about this as a morning garden club meeting. I know many of us are missing those meetings this spring. So I hope everyone has a cup of something nice and warm to drink and maybe a nice little morning snack to munch on. I want to thank again Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Bonnie Rosenthall, the President of the Garden Club Federation of Massachusetts, for working together to make this possible. And I did want to say that if you are missing your garden club meetings and the lectures, if you go to the Ecological Landscape Alliance website, which is that www.ecolandscaping.org, you will find lots of webinars and some newsletter articles on all kinds of different garden topics. So please feel free to do that. Everyone should have a box on their screen that has a place to ask questions. If you do have a question during the lecture, you can just type that in and send it, and Penny, who's moderating this, will be able to present the questions at the very end of the lecture. And I also wanted to say, although we're going to cover plant selection at the very beginning, but this is not really about plants, it's more about design. But I have put some plant lists at the end and a listing of where you can get these plants, because in all my years of doing this, I definitely have found some favorite natives that I like to use and that stand up really well in a civic garden kind of an atmosphere. And last, that's my contact information there. If you have any questions that aren't answered today, please feel free to contact me. So let's get going. So I know that I'm talking to a lot of gardeners who are very knowledgeable on this topic, but it's good just to review why native plants. Because although we know why, many times our clients and the people we work with and the people who view our gardens and visit our gardens don't know. And it's good to be able to give them the answers. So native plants are what support our pollinators, our insects, the butterflies, the bees, the flies, and birds that pollinate everything we eat. So fruits, vegetables, grains, and the flowers that we enjoy and that other creatures of the earth enjoy wouldn't be there without the pollinators. Plants create beautiful habitats and our beautiful surroundings. our woods, our fields, even if we're in the middle of the city, the park, the native plants create that. And if we're going to create gardens, we want plants that grow well and with fewer inputs of water, fertilizer, and maintenance. And it's the native plants that are much better at that than plants that come from other places. And on the right there, you see just a little collection of images that sort of illustrates the importance of native plants. This is my own garden, and I have some fruit trees. I have apples and a peach. The peach especially, it's blooming right now, and it needs to be pollinated, otherwise we don't get fruit. And there are very few pollinators that are out so early, but we do have a bunch of bumblebees. And so I need plants in my garden that are going to support those bees that are out in this cooler early spring weather. And one of the plants that I have is Pieris floribunda. It's our native Andromeda. It's not the Japanese Andromeda, it's a native Andromeda. And the bees are just all over it right now. It's blooming, it's one of the early bloomers. And you can see it at the upper left there. Big old brave bee getting nourished by the flowers. And that's really the story right there. And I wanted to mention that the Garden Club Federation of Massachusetts has been a very early adopter of this idea, very, very early, because from the very beginning, the newsletter of the Garden Club Federation called the Mayflower, and I used to receive this, and I imagine many of you also did, in my mail, in my snail mail as a paper copy, but it always has an image of a Massachusetts native plant on the cover with a little explanation inside about how do you, what are the characteristics of the plant, how to use the plant. And this has been going on for decades now. So I just want to give a little shout out to the Garden Club Federation for that. So since we're now pretty knowledgeable about why we need to plant native plants to support pollinators, many of the gardens that we plant are successful in supporting the pollinators and providing the habitat. However, if you look on the right, and I'm not going to blame anyone else, this is one of my gardens, and granted, it's a parking lot island garden. It was supposed to be a very beautiful native plant garden, but you can see what happened. Now, there were some maintenance issues, but there were also some issues around plant placement, plant selection, and this is how it ended up. And I fear that anyone parking in that parking lot is looking at that and saying, what is that bunch of weeds? Not, look at that beautiful garden. I want one like that at my house. And I've checked this one out in the summer, and there are a lot of pollinators buzzing all around. They're very successful that way. However, Bonnie found this great quote from Charles Kinsley, the ecological designer. It's important that if you're going to plant native gardens, that they be beautiful, because no one's going to be convinced of their value if they're not. And it's so true. A garden needs to touch our soul and our heart, and we need to feel a connection with it. Otherwise, we're not going to be curious about it, and we're not going to admire it, and we're not going to want to do more gardens like that. So beauty is a really important thing. This image here is actually from Wheezy's garden, a garden at the Massachusetts Horticultural Society that I worked on with Julie Meservey. So making them beautiful can be much harder than we realize. And as garden club members, we know what it's like to be out there working away in a garden, sweating it out, the sun beating down, and it's hard. It can be hard. But, you know, there are some reasons why. As we learn more about native plants, we still can be less familiar with their characteristics than with the old list of plants that we always used to plant with that included a lot of flowers that came from other countries. So we're still learning the characteristics and how to plant them and where to plant them and how big they are and all that sort of thing. Also, it might just be very difficult to find native plants, and our local nurseries are getting much better at this, but we still have lots of gaps, and the huge production nurseries have still not mastered how to, in an ecological way, really produce native plants. So that's a problem. And then, you know, as we're taking care of the gardens, we might have a landscaper or we might be the one who does it ourselves, but we just don't know how to take care of them the same way we knew how to take care of other plants. And that's why you'll see that image on the top there of the grass with the flat top haircuts. So if you're going to do a pollinator garden, you really need to leave all of the dried plant material intact and up all through the winter, because it provides very important habitat, sheltering, places for egg masses for pollinators. But a lot of people don't know to do that, and so they cut down their plants like that. And then, you know, also it's hard to switch your aesthetic, and that Victorian bedded out garden that you see on the bottom there is still in many ways a pinnacle of garden aesthetics that we have trouble getting past. And so these are some of the issues around plant selection that are in the whole native plants, pollinator plants world today that we should consider. There are no real answers, but these are things that are being considered. One is, what is the definition of native? If you're going to say, I'm going to plant a native plant garden, well, do you mean you're going to choose plants from all of North America, all of the United States, just the Eastern United States, just New England, just Massachusetts, or there are even people who restrict their native choices to species that are typical of the county that they are in. And this is because native plants, they differ very slightly even from town to town, from county to county. And their relationship with their pollinators is so delicate that sometimes that can make a difference. And also, a lot of the nurseries, realizing that native plants are popular, have taken on breeding them for particular characteristics to make them, you know, more colorful or different forms. And so the straight species is what you would find in nature. The cultivars are these plants that have been bred for specific characteristics that you would never find anywhere but in a garden. And that's illustrated by the two images that you see on the right there. The top is a species purple coneflower. So that's what you would find in nature. And under that are some cultivar purple coneflowers. And you can see that they look very, very different. The color is different and the form is different. And to be honest, it would be very difficult for a pollinator to actually find the pollen or the nectar in those cultivars. So you can say you have native plants in your garden, but if it's a cultivar that's very, very different, that's a problem. And, you know, once again, do nurseries have these plants? You know, if you're going to do a native plant garden, you probably need to check and make sure that the plants are available. And there's still a contingent of plant suppliers who will wild collect, which is not a good idea. You know, it strips the supply from nature. So you really want to have native plants that are nursery propagated. And this can be difficult. Nurseries are still learning how to actually, sprout the seeds and propagate the plants. And then you also need to check and make sure that harmful pesticides weren't used. I'm sure a lot of you know about the controversy around neonicotinoids or neonics, which are a very popular pesticide. They have just recently been supported by the EPA to continue in our marketplace, unfortunately. But these are taken up by the system of the plant, and they remain in the plant for several years in the pollen and the leaves and the flowers. And it's suspected that they kill bees. So if you have a pollinator garden that's filled with plants that were treated with neonics in the nursery, you are killing bees rather than supporting them. So these are all things that you need to consider. And so garden club designers are special. We don't only work on our own gardens, but we have a commitment to work in the public gardens also, the gardens of our towns, to do educating around gardens. And so if we're thinking about native plants, we want to think about what are the kinds of gardens that garden clubs do? And what are the requirements for plants to be successful in these kinds of gardens, which can be sort of rougher gardens than our home gardens. So one of them is civic gardens, of course. It might be that traffic circle, it might be that parking lot island, it might be a little alley between two shops in the center of town, it might be at your library or your church. As garden club members, we all know about those kinds of gardens. And this one pictured here is in the center of Sharon, Massachusetts. It's done by the garden club. It's beautiful. And for these kind of gardens, we need plants that are compact because often the space is constricted, tough, long-lived, lower maintenance, but also that are beautiful, that have a visual and sensory impact, and not only for people strolling by, but people driving by. And our home landscapes as garden club members are also shared with the public often. We do garden tours, we do house tours. People drive by and they know that we're a garden club member and they're looking at our gardens. So this is actually a garden it's a perennial garden, mostly native plants along a sidewalk in front of a house. And for these kinds of gardens, the plants have to be reliable, have that impact. The gardens need to demonstrate good ecological practices, and they should be beautiful too. And then there are our own private gardens, and we're really going to talk less about that today, in fact, hardly at all. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, each of us has a special garden space, whether it be in a large yard or, it's just outside your apartment building, wherever you are. And it's for your pleasure. And often we grow the more delicate natives there. Might be woodland plants or wetland plants. And we try out plants there too. And this is mine here, and it's sort of a woodland edge, and I've got a flowering dogwood, a native dogwood, and I've got underneath that some bloodroot, some Canada anemone, some bugbane, and some Solomon seal. And these are all plants, I would say, except for the dogwood and the Solomon seal, that I might really not use in a civic garden, but they're fun to have at home. So after we've become familiar with the plants, and this is what this talk today is really about, we want to take our gardens from the one at the top, which is a wonderful pollinator habitat, but it's messy looking, to a really beautifully designed garden. And that image at the bottom is part of the Toronto Music Garden done by Julie Meservey. And you can, it's mostly native plants there. There is a percentage of non-natives, but mostly natives. But you can see how the structure of the garden, the materials, and the design just show off those plants and just speak to people about how wonderful a pollinator garden is. So, as I've said several times, we're going to focus on design issues for the kinds of gardens that we as Garden Club members specialize in. And I think some of those issues are, the number one thing is a native plant garden can feel messy. I've had so many clients say this to me. And it's all over the internet. If you Google native plant gardens, that's one of the big questions they ask is, how can I make my garden less messy? The native plants in our region tend to be certain colors, and we'll talk about that later. So we have fewer color choices unless we really make an effort. And by the same token, the foliage and the blooms of our native plants are often very delicate and fine textured. So that can be a challenge to make a garden that has some variety in it. Often we're tempted to leave out the trees and shrubs in our civic gardens because of space issues and cost issues, but there's a really important place for trees and shrubs. So how can we learn how to use them in our garden designs? And then coming back full circle, when you look at your beautiful garden, you want to make sure that the pollinators are there and that you did create the habitat that they need. So addressing this first design issue, that native plant gardens can feel messy. And you remember that image of the garden in the parking lot that I committed, one of our first slides. And this is a garden, this is actually in San Francisco, but it kind of illustrates the point. I'm sure these gardens here support a lot of pollinators and are very good ecologically. But so there are some reasons why native plant gardens can look messy. Most native plants have not been bred to have a neat growth habit. They're wild plants. They grow up, they grow out, they grow all over the place. They haven't been touched by breeders, and they can be, they're not neat little round circles. And that can make it more difficult to design a beautiful garden. And some of them are active spreaders. Virginia rose is one of them. Hay-scented fern is another that actually is invasive, but it has its uses. And many of the native plants in New England are structured so that they have just masses of small flowers and leaves, and that's to do with the kinds of pollinators that we have around here. It's better if you want to create a garden habitat to plant your native plant garden very closely, like a meadow, that you shouldn't see any soil between the plants, but that is not the aesthetic that we're used to with gardens. We're used to gardens with a lot of mulch and plants placed far apart. And that issue of, in your winter garden, you really need to leave everything there. You need to leave it dry and brown to provide good habitat. But people tend to think of that as being ugly. So let's look at some solutions to that messiness problem. And I think the biggest one is to give your native plant garden a neat edge. It could be a very, very crisp, almost rectilinear edge if needed. And the best way to do this naturally is to use natural materials like boulders, pebbles, river stone. You can use paved stones. You can use fencing, either a wall, a stone wall, or a wood fencing. And just give it an edge so that if it froths in the middle, it'll froth over a nice, neat shape. And this garden, this is actually a rain garden on Cape Cod in front of a museum. And being a rain garden, it does have around it what we call the forebay, which filters water flowing in. But the forebay, that's the gravel, and the grass also gives the garden an edge, which is important. And the other thing that I like to do with all my native plant gardens is cluster boulders around. So you put artistic clusters of boulders, sort of in the Japanese garden design sense, and it just gives it a little definition and shape. This one has a bench also, which is good. And I just want to show you, before this garden was planted, how the boulders were placed. So these were all, boulders that were selected, and they were placed in the Japanese style, which means that you bury the boulder so it looks like it's growing up out of the ground. You shouldn't have any spaces underneath a boulder. It should look like it's growing up from the ground, and just placed very artistically, just to give the garden a little edge. Here's another one. This is also a rain garden, planted with all native plants, and right next to it, associated with the garden design, is actually a reading circle. Across the street, that brick building there is a library, and the children's librarians were consulted about this garden, and they said, well, it would be lovely if we had an outdoor space we could bring our kids to and read to them. So there's a boulder sort of half circle there, and the rest of the circle is delineated with paved stone, and it just gives structure to the garden. And I also wanted you to notice that in the interior of the paved stone circle, I've used sedge instead of grass seed. That's Appalachian sedge, and this is when it was first planted. Appalachian sedge grows in tufts, so you can see that there is soil between them, but in the years since this, it's spread quite a bit, and it's mowed just the same way the grass is mowed, but it's a native alternative to lawn grass. Here's a garden at an estate in Maine, and so cobble driveway, the end of a cobble driveway, and with a traditional planting, you might expect to just see a bunch of yew shrubs or something there, but we really decided to commit ourselves to native plants for this garden, and those ferns, I believe that is hay-scented fern, so it is going to spread a lot, but it's defined by that crisp cobble edge. And even if it froths over that a little bit, that rectilinear design is going to hold. This is a memorial garden. A woman's son in his 30s had passed away, and she brought me in to help her design a memorial garden for him and his family. And it was in this tiny little piece of city land in Providence. Actually, no, this is in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I would say about half of those plants are native, and this is when it was first planted, so it's not all filled in yet, but I loved what she did with the wall. She had a friend who's an artist, and there were these concrete walls which really nicely defined the garden. She brought her artist friend in to paint the walls, as a sort of extension of the garden. And this is the kind of creativity you can use with any kind of garden, really, but for a native plant garden that's getting a little unruly, that feels like it's going to get that way, to give it some kind of wonderful edge like this, I think is a really fun idea. Here's a close-up of that wonderful painting, and so there you see a weeping Alaska cedar. So that is not a New England native, that is a West Coast native. So we made the choice for this garden to just use American natives, United States natives. There's smooth hydrangea there. There's, I think it's lady fern, and back against the wall there, that's probably clethra. But you can see there is some Hakonacloa grass, and there are a few things that are not native in there also. This is, we call this the story garden. It's another reading circle at a school, and it's all planted with native plants. Once again, this is early stages. You tend to get your garden photos when they've just been planted. But we have river birch, we have inkberry and red twig dogwood. The only problem here was the grass along the entry path there, which they sent miscanthus instead of panicums. And miscanthus is not a native grass, and I don't recommend using it. So we had that taken out and the panicums put in. But you can see how the circle there, very constrained circle, allows the plants to organize themselves so that if they do start to grow, you know, they start to leaf up and, you know, froth out and stuff, the garden is still going to look organized and not messy. And here's a little native plant garden right by the side of a house. And once again, it's constrained by a fence, a wood fence that just holds it like a barrette holding hair. And the path on the outside does that also. And the owner of this one, you can't really see it, but on those tall fence posts, she put a little garden sculpture on each of those, which is very charming. So those were just the hardscape solutions to the messiness problem. Another solution is to use plants to organize your garden. And I call them sentinel plants because I like to use something kind of tall and skinny, you know, a little bit like a Tuscan cypress might look. And some people will be shocked to know that I use a lot of arborvitae for this. I use emerald. Almost all my clients, the first thing they'll say to me is, I hate arborvitae. I've come to love arborvitae. It is a native tree, and they are actually selecting some nice varieties now that really have quite a bit of form to them. And if you look up close, the branch, the needle pattern, it's almost like little fans. And they're just getting better and better, and they're so useful. And they're very, very good habitat for birds, you know, for any little animal that needs cover, that needs a nesting place or shelter. It's really nice to have them. And so these arborvitaes have been placed almost like the pillars in the shelter structures there in this city native plant garden that has blue stem grass, that's on the left, and I think in the front there is prairie dropseed, which is Sporobolus heterolepis, and there's red twig dogwood shrubs, and a variegated leaf was chosen for that, which is not natural, but that was chosen in this case. And I think we have some Ilex glabra and some panicum grass also. I like this idea so much that I did a little design study to kind of show what happens when you put these sentinel plants in. And this is photoshopped, but this is a typical sort of messy looking native plant garden. It's beautiful, supports pollinators, colorful, wonderful, messy. And look what happens when we put some arborvitae in there. Notice that we did not line them up like soldiers. We chose different heights. So there are some that are maybe 8 feet, some that are 6 feet. You could even tuck some in that are 4 feet in there. And they're clustered at the extremities of the garden, and they just start to give the garden a frame. And then I also chose to put some boulders in. And the garden starts to look more organized. You can also use tall grasses as sentinel plants, and you can use upright rocks, boulders. The blue tree in the middle, it looks like it's a Wichita blue juniper, nice color, and once again, that tall, skinny form. And here's a really fun one. This is back at the at Wheezy's garden, the children's garden at Mass Hort. And at the time these photos were taken, it was mostly planted with native plants. And here you see some smooth hydrangea, the ones with the puffy white flowers. But behind that are cattails. They put cattails in this garden. And I love it. They're tall, they're skinny, they're beautiful. They will last through the winter, and they define the garden in a really nice way. Another solution to the messiness problem is to provide your garden with a focus, a garden object, a garden ornamentation focus. Here we are again at the children's garden, and this is the butterfly garden section. This was designed by Lynette Tsang, a wonderful garden designer. And we put this amazing butterfly bench with a little table right in the center of it. And it just organizes the space. It just gives some definition to what's going on. We've also used the Hardscape solution here. Those paths define the shape of butterfly wings. So the Coreopsis moonbeam in the center can froth up and out as much as it wants, but it's constrained in a way that makes it look pretty. You can place sculpture or those beautiful large urns, an arbor or a trellis, maybe painted in a wonderful color. Just putting that in the garden gives it a focus and a definition for the native plants that are around those objects. Your garden object can actually be a natural object. This is a piece of ledge that was sticking up in this garden in coastal Maine. And so we just planted it up. And on the right, those geraniums, I think, are not natives, though that's Roseanne, but you can use native geraniums instead. And there are a lot of wonderful ferns there and some sedges, I think, and some moss. And just, having noticed that natural object and selected it, it's a wonderful showcase for native plants. You can also, instead of planting sort of a thingy garden with 3 of this and 3 of that and 5 of that all next to each other, mass your plants a little bit more. This is mayapple. We do know that mayapple is somewhat invasive and then it dies down in the middle of the summer, but it makes a wonderful mass planting in the spring. And underneath this mayapple is geranium. So that pops up when the mayapple dies down, and it just gives a nice solid structure to this garden, which is at the top of a driveway at the intersection of a sidewalk and a road. And this is hay-scented fern, just massed really as a foundation planting. And once again, there are some other plantings in there that will pop out in wintertime. But it really just gives a nice solid skirt to that house that doesn't look messy at all, especially when it's edged by a gravel path. And this is an idea that I just learned about a month ago at a conference. If you're worried about your winter garden with all of those brown upright stems that are so important because they have seeds and they have egg masses in them, but if you don't like that look, why not gather the stems into bunches? And you can either cut them and bunch them, or you could just take a piece of string or even a long piece of grass and just bunch your grasses all through the garden so they look kind of like corn stalks. It's a much more organized look, and I think everyone driving by would love to see that in the wintertime. So those are some ideas for organizing your messy native plant garden. And so some other design issues that are, I think, are important. So in New England, many of our wildflowers are yellow, white, or purple. We don't have the variety of other colors that you would have if you were using plants from all over the world in a garden. And yeah, there's a reason for that. The yellows, purples, and whites are colors that bees can see. And so there are some colors that bees just can't see at all, like red. So they're attracted to those. And often, especially the yellow flowers, the daisy form yellow flowers, have actually something called a nectar guide, which is invisible to us, but the bee can see it. It's a circle of pigment around the center of the flower. And yellow flowers can do that. I think the whatever the compounds are that create the color in those, they can make those nectar guides most easily in a yellow flower. Now, if you attempt to bring in some native cultivars to color up your garden a bit, often those plants are weaker. We had the example of the echinacea earlier in the lecture. Those echinaceas, I have not found them to be very lasting. Often you have to treat them like annuals. So even if you try to bring color in, it can be a challenge. And if you think about the colors of leaves, many caterpillars that eat leaves are green and they want to be camouflaged from birds. And so the leaves and the caterpillars sort of want to cooperate with their colors. Some of the new cultivars of shrubs in particular have been selected for red leaf color, and that red leaf color can actually be poisonous to some caterpillars. So like some of the nine barks, some of the weigela, although weigela is not a native plant, but they've been bred to have this sort of burgundy color. And so they are naturally host plants for caterpillars that can not only show up a lot on those red leaves, but also get poisoned by them. So if you want to bring these hot colors into your garden, or blues, you need to actively seek out the native plants that have them. And you can feel okay because birds are attracted to reds and oranges in particular. And so you need to find the scarlet bee balm right there in the middle. That's Jacob Klein. It's a very, very popular selection. And it's fabulous for pollinators. Or your swamp mallow. There's a more southern variety that's bright red on the left there. On the top right, you see scarlet bee balm, and that's with some anise hyssop, giving a nice blue tone. And then, of course, cardinal flower, scarlet lobelia, is just a wonderful plant that you wouldn't think would grow in a lot of different conditions, but it really does. It's a real performer. For your oranges, Of course, there's butterfly weed, one of the milkweeds. There's Gaillardia, which is more of a prairie plant, but great for pollinators. And down here, this little tiny new garden here has some yarrow in it. I'm just pointing to it with my cursor. The yarrows can come in a lot of nice oranges. And one thing I do rely on is daylilies, not native. There are a lot of daylilies that have escaped cultivation that you'll see by the side of the road, but it is actually not a native North American species. But if I do have to have a small percentage of non-natives in my gardens, it will often be daylilies because they do provide that punch of color and they're very reliable. And so we've put orange daylilies in this garden. And then, of course, you can choose a shrub that has a wonderful fall color. You have to wait till fall, but how gorgeous against that evergreen inkberry there. And to be honest, when I took this photo out of my archives, I thought at first that it was fragrant sumac, which is a shrub like that, and it exhibits that gorgeous fall color. Looking more closely at the leaves, I don't think that's what it is. It could be a aronia, maybe. I'm not sure actually what that plant is, but it's the idea. And you have to plan a little bit more if you want a range of colors. So you can just do a little drawing of your garden, and it doesn't have to be fancy like this. You can just get out your color pencils or your markers and think about what colors you want, where you're going to place them, and then check your plant lists to see which plants exhibit those colors. So that way you can achieve a native plant garden like this, which is, it's a pink, purple, and blue garden. And there's a little bit of white in there too, but very specifically selected native plants. There are, let's see, there's a calamagrostis in there, which is not native, but everything, almost everything else is. There's Joe Pye weed, garden phlox. How many people knew that garden phlox is a Native American plant? And it will revert to this magenta, but if you let it just breed in your garden, you're going to start coming up with all different kinds of magenta, pale pink, dark purple, all kinds of wonderful shades. There's milkweed, clethra, there's some Virginia rose in here. So this is very different from a native plant garden that's all yellows and purples. You can introduce color once again by just using those garden ornaments. Look how wonderful this image is. And the only problem with it is that that grass is miscanthus, not a native. But if you replaced it with one of the very tall panicums, like heavy metal or one of those, it would be a wonderful native plant garden with those gorgeous colors. So not a design solution, once again, are these cultivars that are just very, very different from the species. These are not going to support your pollinators at all. And so, you know, similar to that, the texture of the plants tends to be light, feathery, small flowered in New England. And, you know, the reason is because of where we are. We have a long winter. That's not counting climate change, but normally we would have a long winter and a short summer, not a whole lot of growing time to develop, you know, these really expansive, huge tropical type leaves. We're also relatively dry here in New England, and the photo on the right actually is Oregon, which is a temperate rainforest. And that is the normal height of trees in Oregon. You can just see they're twice as tall as any New England trees. And it's because it's a temperate rainforest and the climate is just different. Also, the kinds of pollinators we have in New England, the bees, the butterflies, they want to bumble all over a selection of tiny little flowers. It's just how they collect the pollen. And so it's the symbiosis between the plants and the insects. So how to deal with that, how to sort of give a little bit of impact to the garden. Well, in this case, yes, you should mix it up a bit. And, you know, especially if you have a nice, clean hardscape, you can really mix it up a little bit in your gardens. So here's a garden at Moses Brown School in Providence that has evergreen shrubs, grasses. There are some flowering plants there in the middle, which I can't see, and there's some dogwood, some red twig dogwood, and then there are taller trees, and I think some of those are not native trees. But by mixing it up a bit, the garden develops some texture and interest. And here's, you know, another example of that. You've got some evergreen trees in the back, and then you've got your red twig dogwood. Once again, the variegated leaf has been chosen here. And then in the front, you've got bugbane, I believe. But it's planted in swaths, and in the wintertime, those red twig dogwoods are going to shed their leaves, and the stems will be scarlet against the evergreen with the snow. It's going to be beautiful. You know, another solution is just to really actively seek out plants with a slightly large, ungainly, you know, either tall or big leaves, big blossoms. So you have your swamp mallow, you have your sweet fern, which is not large, but the leaves are so interesting in shape. Ferns are wonderful for this. On the left, you have ostrich fern. It's very tall. It will actually, if it likes where it is, it will come up all over the place, but it really adds to the texture of a garden. And on the right, you have cutleaf coneflower. Again, very tall and very hardy. And on the left, you've got Joe Pye weed. This right here, very tall and very structural and architectural in form. And then I also want to give a shout out to actively planting common milkweed in your garden. If the garden is planted with lots of other stuff, it's not going to get invasive. And the leaves are big and glossy, and the flowers they smell so sweet. And it's really a wonderful garden plant, and it just gives some chunkiness to an otherwise very finely textured garden. And my favorite is oak leaf hydrangea, which to me really does look tropical. In many of the varieties of oak leaf hydrangea, the leaves are huge, and they get that lovely ruby color naturally in the fall. Using trees and shrubs in your native garden. You can have a native garden with all trees and shrubs. This is a residential setting here, but it's just a small area, but we've used compact forms of conifers. Some of the reasons people steer away from using trees and shrubs is that, you know, if you're a garden club and you've been given a small plot to plant, a tree or a shrub can just seem like it's going to be way too big for that, and you want to stick with just perennials. You want maybe a meadowy looking garden. They're harder to plant. You have to, you know, if we're out there wielding our shovels, you got to dig a wide hole, not so deep, but very wide. And with the budgets that we work with for our civic gardens, they're more expensive. But there are a whole lot of naturally compact shrubs and trees that you can use even in a city garden. And actually, nurseries are coming out now with some more compact forms of plants. This one here in the middle is that it's called low mound aronia or something like that. You know, aronia is choke cherry. I see no reason not to use these kinds of cultivars. I think they've really just been bred for size, but the form is the same as the species. So they're going to produce the flowers and berries that they normally would, or attracting pollinators. It's just that they're small. Here we have Clethra hummingbird. This is once again the Pieris floribunda, the mountain Pieris. Is this Calicarpa? It's sweet shrub. Wonderful, wonderful plant. Smooth hydrangea. And the weeping Alaska cedar gives such character to a small garden. All you have to do is put one of those in there and and everything comes together. You can see how sculptural the form is. And then my favorite arborvitae. And us garden club members pretty much know about this, but don't hesitate to put trees and shrubs in a civic garden because you're afraid of the work that needs to be done. If you make friends with your DPW, your tree warden, or your parks manager, they will usually send a piece of equipment out to dig those holes for you. You can decide to use fewer trees, maybe just one, but with a bunch of interesting ground cover like ferns or the bugbane that's there. And of course, there's always the good old memorial tree program. Many towns have them, and you can tap the funds. If you have a design that you think is going to be a little bit messy for say a traffic circle or something like that, and you just feel that putting a tree, maybe a silver bell, a halesia or something like that, will give some form. Go ahead and see if someone might donate that tree for you. And now we're almost near the end, and if you haven't submitted a question that you have, now would be the time to do it. So we're just going to look at one more issue, sort of the bringing it full circle issue, which is that, once you've designed this beautiful garden, is the purpose of supporting pollinators, is it still there? Bees don't care if the garden is beautiful, but people do. So how closely did you plant? Many landscaping firms, this is how they like to plant. It's like one plant every 6 feet with a whole lot of mulch. And this is going to take a really long time to support pollinators. Here's that sidewalk garden again. Everything's just packed in. It's a really good environment, and it's full of bees and butterflies and birds and hummingbirds all summer long. And what holds it together is really the color, I would say. If you can buy a species plant rather than a cultivar, please do that. It's just better for the pollinators. They've been evolved to use these plants. So Bonnie Rosenthall's goal is that all of us garden clubs try to start planting at least 50% natives in all our gardens. And as you can see, you can achieve a beautiful garden if you use some of these wonderful, wonderful plants. And I just, as a last caution, the plant at the upper left with the red X through it, that's butterfly bush or buddleia. And a lot of nurseries are selling that as a butterfly plant, as a pollinator plant. I want to try to dissuade you from using it. It's not native. And a friend of mine described it once, that she said it's like crack, the drug crack to a butterfly, because butterflies are so attracted to it that they get confused and they won't lay their eggs on the proper host plant for their caterpillars, and then their caterpillars die. So try to avoid having plants like that in your native plant garden that sort of distract pollinators, that are very beautiful, but really ecologically don't make sense. And that wraps it up. There are some lists of my favorite plants here, and you can revisit we'll be recording the show, so you can revisit to find those plants. I guarantee all of those are going to work great for you in no matter how much, road salt, snow, whatever gets thrown on them. And then the very last sheet here is a list of plant sources, but I highly recommend you go to the Grow Native Massachusetts website, which is on the bottom there. They have a wonderful, wonderful list of local nurseries that sell these plants. So please go ahead and visit that. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, now would be the time to, I think Penny's going to moderate collecting the questions and asking them if there are any.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amanda. Wonderful information. And we do have several questions. The first is, what are drought-resistant plants for the north of Boston area?
So what you want to do is look at your, you're going to think this is funny, but the roadside weeds, the native ones, are the most drought-resistant plants that you can imagine. So for perennials, your goldenrods, your asters, trying to think of some earlier spring ones. For a shrub, the sweet shrub, the Comptonia, is wonderful. So all of those plants that will grow in kind of hard pack sand by the road are wonderfully drought resistant. Almost all of your grasses are going to be drought resistant. Let's see, you want to think about plants that are sun tolerant, not shade tolerant. So not the plants that will grow at the woodland edge or in the woodland or in a wetland, that sort of thing. And you can certainly, the person who asked this question can certainly email me, and I can, highlight some from my lists if they would like further information.
Excellent, thank you. What natives can we plant that birds might build their nests in?
Oh, well, so your evergreen shrubs and those compact trees are wonderful for that. So Ilex glabra, the inkberry, I've seen lots of bird nests in those. The arborvitae, I've seen lots of birds' nests in those, and actually birds shelter in those also in the wintertime, because the structure of a evergreen tree like that, it tends to gather a coating of snow on the outside, but the interior branches remain bare and provide really good cover for birds.
Excellent. Do you have a suggestion for where we might look for companion plantings that are natives?
If you take a look at the plant sources slide, which I believe is up right now still, if everyone can see it, any of those nurseries are wonderful for having and if you for finding native plants. You just want to ask, make sure that they were nursery propagated and that neonics were not used. What is the source of this plant, you might want to ask. If you're looking specifically for companion plantings, like in a vegetable garden kind of a thing, that's beyond my area of expertise. But, that has to do with the whole idea that there are some kind of plants that work better together, that kind of support each other. That's actually beyond my area of expertise. But I'd love to learn more about it. So maybe we could email about that.
Very good. Are there any suggestions that you have for native plants to use as foundation plantings, or any warnings about the list of plants that you provided?
Okay, well, absolutely, foundation plantings. So I love leucothoe. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, I don't like, that's hobblebush. It's an evergreen, sort of an arching shrub, wand-like branches, beautiful glossy evergreen. I love it, but a lot of people will say, oh, that one looks too messy to me. Well, I want to encourage you to stick with your leucothoe. When you first plant it, if you get small plants, they are going to look a little ragged. But as the planting matures, it becomes this beautiful mass of sort of wavy, long mass of beautiful, glossy evergreen. It flowers quite early in the spring, so it supports a lot of the early pollinators, and it's a perfect height for a foundation plant. I love Solomon's seal for a foundation plant. It is a perennial, so it will die down in the winter, but if you support it with some of the evergreen shrubs, it is a fantastic plant, and I have seen Solomon's seal growing in the middle of the city at the foot of an old wall where it gets trampled, it gets snowed on, it gets salted on, but it's very, very tough. And any of the ferns are wonderful foundation plants. Also, there are some evergreen ferns in my list. Christmas fern is one of them, and marginal wood fern is another. And you can get American holly in small forms that are very nice foundation plants. And of course, they have the beautiful red berries, which look so great with the snow in the wintertime. And then the other part of that question was warnings.
Are there any warnings for plants that you would not put in a foundation planting?
I think it really depends on the purpose of your foundation planting to a certain extent. If you just want something decorative, then I would go with the ones that I just mentioned. You can use grasses too. They're a nice big bunch of panicum would look lovely at the corner of a house. If you want to make a statement from the road, those kinds of plants. I actually have started a little collection of woodland plants in my foundation planting because I like to walk around my garden and see what's growing. We have a lot of deer in our woods who eat the little spring ephemerals like the anemones and the Canada Mayflower. But I would like to have them in my landscape, and the deer don't come to our foundation planting. So I have some very delicate little plants in my foundation planting. I would encourage you to use your foundation planting, use it more if you're a real gardener. Maybe use it as a trial garden even if you want.
All right. You mentioned deer, and we have several questions about deer and bunnies. So the first is someone who planted Carex pennsylvanica, and the bunnies are chomping it to the ground. Any suggestions?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, wildlife. What can we do? I've tried everything. I don't have a really good foolproof answer because, frankly, every plant I recommend, that the deer won't eat it. I then hear the following year that the deer ate all of it. So, but one thing I have tried to do is actually protect areas where, say I do have a ground cover planting or a grass type area. And, first of all, with my lawn type areas, I always try, instead of lawn being default planting, so wherever you don't have your shaped gardens, you have lawn, I try to do it the other way around. My lawn plantings are a shape and everything else is garden. So you can, if you have your lawn, say it's a perfect oval in your backyard, you can plant all around that with leucothoe. Deer, it gets pretty thick and shrubby, and the deer don't like to jump through it as much, and they will not touch leucothoe to eat. They won't touch pyrus either. Sometimes you have to go non-native and protect your native plantings with really stinky, stuff like that deer won't eat, like lavender. What are some other really smelly ones? Chamomile, yarrow, sweet fern, plants like that have a sort of a yucky, stinky smell that I've used rue, the herb rue, R-U-E, which is actually hard to find in the nurseries now because it's poisonous, but deer hate it, and it grows into a little shrub. And that, if I have a planting of rue all around my vegetable garden, it keeps the bunnies away. So.
Very good. What do you do about deer eating all of your beloved arborvitaes?
Now, this is a very, 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 I knew this question was going to come, which is why I put juniper in there also. So on my plant list, there are some columnar forms of juniper that look very much like the arborvitae. And of course, Juniperus virginiana is a wonderful plant, and it has berries that birds like, which arborvitae does not have. And deer don't eat juniper because it has a very strong flavor. So you can use that instead. Hollies you can't use because deer, even though they're all spiky, deer will eat them.
Interesting. Can you suggest how to encourage and maintain a moss garden?
Oh, well, moss, I love moss. People who have moss growing in their lawns, I say keep it there unless, unless your kids are running around on it so much that it gets, torn up and stuff. But I would absolutely encourage moss. Moss likes to grow in an acidic base. And I'm going to recommend a book. I think it's called The Magic of Moss Gardening, and it's written by a woman called Mossin Annie, who lives in North Carolina, I believe. She has written an article that you will find on the Eco Landscaping website that's in the slides, all about how to grow a moss garden. So look up Mossin Annie, and you'll find out everything you need to know about that.
Great suggestion. What is the deciduous tree in the slide with the shelter?
So I have a terrible feeling that is not a native, and that it might even be a calorie pear, which is the ubiquitous flowering non-native tree that's such a problem at least in the New England landscape. There are just too many of them. And I think that tree was there before we planted the rest of it. As a substitute for a tree like that, I would suggest either flowering dogwood. I myself do not use Kusa dogwoods, the Chinese dogwood. It's a very pretty tree. I prefer to use the native dogwood. Maybe 15 or 20 years ago, native dogwoods were having a problem with anthracnose disease. That seems to have subsided, and in many cases, it happened to the tree because flowering dogwood is a forest edge tree, and it doesn't want to live out in the very middle of a sunny lawn, and a lot of people were planting them there. So if you have a somewhat semi-shady position, I would go right ahead and use a flowering dogwood or a silver bell tree, a fringe tree. There are a bunch of flowering trees on my list that are small that I would use instead of a calorie pear. If anyone ever says, plant a calorie pear there, you say no.
Okay, the next question is, where do you look for landscape boulders?
Okay, really good question. So if you're doing a civic planting, which, okay, you're trying to save some money, I would first go to your DPW and see. So a lot of times DPWs have supply yard, and that's the Department of Public Works in your town. They'll have some materials yards out back with old granite curbing, boulders, all kinds of stuff. And often they are very willing to let you come and select some of them. And sometimes they'll even put them on a truck for you and deliver them to the site. And sometimes they'll even, send a little bobcat and a sling and a couple of guys and place those boulders for you. So that's the first place I'd start. Also, if you have development going on in your town, if you have a new neighborhood going in or a new building going in and there's some digging going on, it's New England. There are guaranteed to be boulders, and sometimes you can beg them off the contractor. So those are sort of low-cost ways to do it. Otherwise, you do need to go to a stone yard or a place that sells gravel and sand and hardscape materials, and they will usually have a pile of landscape boulders that you can choose from, and then you have to pay for them to be delivered to your site, and then you need to pay a landscaper with some equipment to place them for you. And you should be there when your boulders are placed because you want them in a nice sculptural form. And often the guy or the gal on the bobcat needs your guidance on that.
Very, very good points. Can you recommend native plants for wet soil where there's a high water table?
Well, so if it's constantly wet, if it's kind of swampy, then you want to use some of the wetland plants. And so there's some wonderful sedges. There's blue flag iris, the cattails, marsh marigold is really nice. And so all of those plants you would probably want to put in a home garden, a garden that's a little bit removed from damaging circumstances. If you have a wet spot for a civic garden, you might want to think about instead putting a rain garden in there. If it's a wet spot that's only sometimes wet, you might want to watch it for a while because especially like in a rain garden type site, it's actually more often dry than wet. So you need plants that will tolerate a very broad spectrum of inundation sometimes and drought other times. And for those kinds of plants, once again, your drought tolerant sort of roadside weed type plants, the bee balm, the goldenrods, the asters, a bunch of the other perennials that are on my list. Milkweed, pack it up with milkweed. That would be great.
Excellent. What are your thoughts on jewelweed?
Oh, well, I love jewelweed. In my experience, it's best used as a wetland plant. It really does want to live sort of on a stream bank, in the woods, in the shade. So I would count it as one of those more delicate plants that has a very specific environment it wants to live in. If it is, I know of a few towns where there are streams running through as part of the town stormwater system, and it's a public stream. And jewelweed planted there would be just great because it's always going to have that water, coming up and down. But that might be the only sort of public type situation where I would plant jewelweed.
Okay, very good. What are your thoughts on pruning native shrubs?
Well, I really think that to a certain extent, it really depends on the aesthetic that you're looking for. And so if it's a flowering native shrub and you're going to need those flowers, you can selectively prune right after flowering, because the thing you don't want to do is prune off the bloom for next year. If you're pruning because you want a more structured form, you want a particular shape, or say you chose a compact shrub, but it is, after 10 years, it is growing out of its space, and you need to prune. I would say go ahead and do it. Something that's growing out of its space, you can selectively prune. So go in with hand pruners and grab those branches that are really sticking out and cut those back, but leave maybe a little bit of a loose look to it. A lot of native shrubs will come right back. In fact, I've even had my husband once mowed. I had a brand new hazelnut, a native hazelnut that I had planted at the edge of my lawn. It was just a tiny little shrubby looking thing, and my husband mowed it, and I came screaming home, no! But I protected it, and it came back, and it's now a small tree. So a lot of these native shrubs will tolerate a whole lot of pruning. And then if you need to have like a hockey puck shape or a Christmas tree shape or a perfectly round globe, I would say, instead of a pruned plant that's exotic, heck, go ahead and make it a native plant. Why not?
Very good. Someone has Jerusalem artichoke in spots in the yard, and the bees seem to love it. What are your thoughts on this plant?
Yes, I believe that is also known as woodland sunflower. It's my suspicion that if it's the particular one I'm thinking about, there are a lot of sort of tall sunflowery looking plants that can be mistaken for each other, but I think it's great. You can eat the roots, and I would say if you have more curiosity about it, Google it and see if it's a host for any particular pollinator. But I don't see any problem with it.
Okay, very good. What do you suggest planting under hay-scented ferns for winter interest?
Yes. Oh, that's a difficult one. Um, so the reason it's difficult, hay-scented fern really is, it would be invasive if it wasn't native. I mean, it is invasive. It's native, but it is invasive. It will really spread where it wants to go, and it forms a very tough, compact root mass. And it's really difficult for other plants to come up through it. Some of the ones that I've used are pulmonaria, which is not native. Some of your little pokers up in the spring, like right now when the hay-scented fern hasn't popped up yet, Canada Mayflower, wintergreen, some of your forest floor plants you could try. You could maybe try plugging those in certain places. And then so things like wintergreen are going to be green all winter. I mean, it's very low growing, but it's green and it does have the red berries. You know, maybe if you really planted your hay-scented fern bed up with some winterberry, this idea is just occurring to me, but that might be a really good way to have some winter interest. And then, of course, in the summer, you know, your stronger plants will poke up through your Solomon seal and your shrubs and all that sort of thing.
Good. What cultivar or variety of arborvitae were you using in many of those installations?
So that was emerald green. It's like like the Callery pear. It's a completely ubiquitous small tree, but it's native and it has a use. So if you can get emerald green arborvitae almost anywhere, and there's another variety that I just came across, which is also in my plant lists there. And just to note, my plant lists, I've listed them alphabetically, but by common name. Often you'll see plant lists listed by Latin name, and I just decided people might be more familiar with the common name, and so alphabetically it's by common name there. So I think it's on the tree list, and it's called, and it's an A, so it'll be one of the first on the tree list there. And I think there are two varieties I list.
Okay, very good.
And I'm sorry. I'm really getting going, but I just want to butt in again about the arborvitae. So a lot of people hate arborvitae because they grew up with older forms of it, like the green giant. And there are a bunch of ones that really grow big after many years, and don't have and haven't been selected for a really nice form. And those can be overwhelming looking. But I think nowadays there are some people who are selecting varieties for a compact particular form. And so I think as we go on with arborvitae, we're going to get more and more, people are going to love them more and more, I think.
Very good. Do you have a reference book that you can recommend for selecting native plants by colors?
Well, there isn't one that springs to mind. I would once again go to the eco landscaping site, and you might go to the newsletter articles. There's a place where you can filter what you're looking for in there, and maybe type in choose plants by color or something like that, and see if anything pops up. I'm drawing a blank for native plants. There are certainly gardening books that are organized that way. I can't think of a native plant book at this moment that is, but I'm sure there's one out there.
Okay, very good. What eastern States native tree do you recommend that could take the structural place of an Alaskan cedar?
Well, there are, so you can look at the evergreens on my list. So I've listed the Chamaecyparis, which is the cedar. You could try maybe a Atlantic white cedar, which I think is also on the list there. It's Chamaecyparis thyoides. They are starting to select some varieties of that now. I don't know of one that has the weeping habit, but the thyoides have a more open, it's a more open sort of sculptural habit than some of the more closely packed junipers and arborvitae. But you could also look at, I think I list some spruces there. There is a very narrow columnar weeping blue spruce that it has the weeping habit, but it's not as far-flung looking as the Nootka, as the Alaskan cedar. You can go on the Weston Nurseries website, and they have a plant finder. Once again, you can filter what exactly you're looking for by using words. You might do that and see what you could find there.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between native and Japanese Andromeda?
Yes. Okay. So Japanese Andromeda is a very commonly planted, it's a nice plant, very commonly planted evergreen, glossy leaves, and it blooms with these beautiful drooping white bells about now. Actually, it's one of the very first bloomers in the spring here in New England. Comes from Japan. We've been using it in our landscapes for many, many decades. And there are many different varieties, some compact, some wider ranging. If you let it grow, it will turn into a very large shrub. And, it does support the early bees. However, if you decide that native is really important to you, you can use the native Pieris, the mountain Andromeda, which it comes from, South Carolina, those Piedmont woods down there. It's a more rangy shrub in form, more upright, whereas the Japanese Andromeda flowers droop. The mountain Andromeda flowers are perky. The little bells droop, but they're arranged in a panicle that's very erect. And the shape of the flower is a little bit different, and it's a little more pure white than the Japanese Andromeda. And it's sort of a taller, skinnier shrub, but unless you need something extremely round and compact in form, it's a really nice shrub. I think it's probably difficult to find. If we just keep asking for it. The one that I have was actually here on the property of my house when we bought the house, and I don't know where they found it. It was in the garden. So I think there are also some hybrids with the native Andromeda that you could look at.
Okay, very good. Can you supply a list of plants according to size or growth habit, or is there a source that you would go to for that?
Yes, actually, so some of the nurseries will do that in their catalogs. Van Berkom Nursery, which is on the list here, they have some wonderful lists at the back of the catalog that sort plants by actually native plants by color, that might be, rather than a book, that might be one thing to do, is look at a plant catalog. They sort by, exposure, by size, by all kinds of different things. Let's see. Plenty of the nurseries do that. Van Berkom is one I can think of, but and I don't know if the online versions of I know many nurseries are just going to online versions of their catalogs now. Some of them I've seen do have these charts online, and some of them you have to, call or write to the nursery and ask them if they'll actually send you the book. But it does involve a little bit of work. You have to go look through and, select particular plants.
Okay, very good. It's important to note that Van Berkom Nursery is a wholesale only. So
thank you, Penny. Thank you.
They do supply materials to a lot of retail garden shops that you would all be able to access. And they do have specialty lists on their website that are available as resources to non-list professionals.
So you could look at those lists that are put out by the wholesale nurseries, and then go to your local nursery and select the plant. Van Berkom has a line called the Wicked Ruggeds. They're New England natives that work really well in New England gardens, right? And they have a lot of the nurseries have a little icon next to all of the plants that are native. You'll find a lot of information in those catalogs.
You have a picture of Rosa rugosa. Is that native variety?
Well, in fact, that is not Rosa rugosa. If you're talking about the close-up, that is Rosa virginiana. Wonderful, wonderful native rose. It pretty much comes in only that pink color. It's a single petaled with a beautiful golden boss in the center. I don't know if that's the photo that you were thinking of. So our native roses, we've got Rosa virginiana, Rosa carolina, and Rosa palustris, which is the swamp rose. The flowers all look very much like that photo. It's just the most gorgeous pink, pure clear pink with this wonderful golden boss in the center. And they really are pretty interchangeable. Swamp rose probably wants a little bit more moisture. That's actually one, if you have a sunny, moist area, that's one you could definitely use. Now, in the picture of the very closely packed sidewalk edge garden, the pink garden, there were a few rugosa roses in there, but I think the image was so small that it would have been hard to pick them out. And there are lots of Virginia roses in that garden also. So the rugosa rose comes from China. And it's the one, it has those wonderful big red hips, but Virginia rose, the native roses have those hips also, which provide food for wildlife in the winter. I'm not opposed to rugosa roses. I think if you have a chance to have some of the native roses in your garden, add them to your rugosas, because they're really great.
Okay, very good. Can you give us a suggestion for an alternative to boxwood, since boxwoods are not native?
Yes, I think the compact forms of Ilex glabra, the inkberry, are one very good choice. They have come out with a new one. I think it's called something box. It's an inkberry, Ilex glabra, something box, a jewel box or box jewel or something like that. And it's been selected specifically to mimic the form of that English box. So it's very round, not tiny, but not too big. Now, the only thing about box is that I'm sorry, about Ilex glabra, is that like box, it really would like to be planted in a sunny place. So if you're using it to, say you have a medieval knot garden type thing you're doing, or an herb garden, um, it, that sort of a garden, you would probably put that in a very sunny area anyway. So jewel box, or one of the very compact boxes, another is shamrock, would work very well for that. The other thing you can do is go to the arborvitaes, and they are now producing arborvitaes that are shaped like little round balls. But that gives, so you have the form and the color, the texture is going to be different. But if you don't mind that, then those are a couple of shrubs that you could use.
Excellent, very good. We are going to take just one more question. How do you use staghorn sumac? And do you prune them if you use them?
Love sumacs, all of them. The staghorn is great, very representative. And I use it in gardens. I use it in ecological restorations. It's a wonderful, it's a wonderful plant in every sense. It looks a little different. It's very structural. It has gorgeous fall color. It has these wonderful fuzzy red berries that you can turn into sumac lemonade. And so I love to use it, and I do use it. I will selectively prune. So sometimes those sumacs the tree form sumacs, not the low ones, like fragrant sumac tends to just stay like a low shrubby crawly kind of a thing. But a staghorn type sumac wants to grow into a big tree form. And the branches are pretty sparse, and the wood is soft. So sometimes you'll find that it really starts to grow in just it looks like a stalk. It looks like one big stalk going up. And then I would prune the top to encourage branching lower down on the stem. And you want to put it in a place where it can get bigger. It can be planted as a specimen plant. I have to tell you that my family and I were visiting Italian Renaissance gardens many decades ago. These old, beautiful gardens in Italy, and many of them had an American sumac as a specimen plant. So that was really fun to see. But you can group them also. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.